I'm joined by Saul Kavonic, Senior Energy Analyst at MST Marquee. Saul, thanks for your time. If Israel do retaliate at Iran, I mean, what could that mean for Iranian oil production and the oil market more generally?
Well, it looks like some form of retaliation is inevitable, and it's just talking about what the scope of that would be. So if we look at the situation we sit in today, the last few months have been very bearish for oil. But we're starting to see that turn around. We've seen stimulus announced in China and in the United States. We've seen OPEC starting to delay the unwind of its cuts. But these geopolitical events, particularly overnight, is what could completely change the game for energy globally. 20% of the world's oil and LNG come through the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. And in the kind of worst, most severe case scenario, that could be impacted. But in terms of direct attacks, what we're seeing reported is one of the targets that Israel could take in its retaliation here is the Kark Island, which is where close to 90% of Iran's crude exports come from. And just to give a context of that, that's 2 to 3% of global oil supply. Wow. That's enough to, it sounds small in the percentage terms, but that completely changes the game. We could see, if that was attacked, we could see oil go above $100 a barrel again. That's kind of a more mid-case scenario where we see that kind of disruption. But what's the bigger risk here is, as we saw just in recent hours, Iran has said that if Israel retaliates, Iran will retaliate even more strongly again. And this potential for a wider conflagration of the conflict, which could see the Strait of Hormuz impacted so that oil flows from other countries like Saudi and the UAE can't get out. If that's impacted, we're talking about an impact on the oil market which would be 3 times the size of the 1970s oil shocks after the Iranian Revolution and the Arab oil embargo, which was the last time we saw a real big supply disruption in the Middle East. We're then talking about $150, $200 oil, even higher LNG prices, and that could cause global economic recession, hit economies all around the world, including here at home in Australia.
That's obviously something that no one wants to see happen. But you go back to 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a massive spike in energy prices back then, oil and gas in particular. Do you think we could see a similarity here or not really?
So there's the potential for it, and it's the potential for it to be much worse than what we saw in 2022. There's 2 reasons for that. First of all, in 2022, gas supply was restricted, but ultimately oil wasn't impacted. What we're talking about here is oil could be impacted and LNG on a greater scale than we saw in 2022 together, and this comes on top of an already tighter market in gas because we're still facing the aftermath of the turning off of Russian supply. So all these impacts compound, they can happen at the same time, and that's why I think we could see potentially record high prices if this wider conflagration eventuates. But even without that more severe scenario, in more mid-case scenarios, we're still looking at potential tightening from direct attacks or even just tougher sanctions that are placed on Iranian oil exports.
We just saw the best performers on the stock market today, and not really any surprise, the big Aussie oil producers are in there. I mean, what's the outlook for Aussie ASX-listed oil companies at this stage?
Look, overall, they're actually quite cheap. They've been sold off a lot over the last few months. They're pricing in a long-term oil price closer to 60 when oil today is in the 70s and could, if you look at the risk skew here, there's potential that it could jump tens of dollars a barrel. Whereas if all of the situation de-escalates, there's probably only a few dollars a barrel that it would drop. So we would argue that a lot of the oil names are looking quite good value from an investment perspective. And the risk skew is really turning to the upside. They've been oversold. The market has been very bearish in recent months. But like I said, we've started to see news flow that's turned it around. Now the potential impact of geopolitical events in the Middle East, this is all positive for oil prices. Obviously not great for world security and a lot of folks involved who could be impacted, but the impact on energy markets would be very, very bullish.
Saw an announcement today from Santos as well, signing a long-term LNG deal with Total Energies. I mean, there's obviously still a lot of demand from foreign buyers for our resources.
Absolutely. So despite a lot of the narrative you might hear sometimes about decarbonisation, peak oil demand, etc., the reality is the world's biggest buyers, and particularly in Japan and North Asia, they are more than ever going after securing more LNG in particular, and we're talking about long-term deals, 20, even 30 years. They're locking in LNG demand well beyond 2050 because for them, energy security is paramount. Gas is still much cleaner than coal, and they really need to have flexible sources of energy security that they can rely on, and it's bringing Australia back to the fore because they're starting to see risk both in the US politically and now in the Middle East geopolitically. Australia is nearby, and despite a lot of, I guess, policy headwinds that we've seen in Australia with our Labor government since 2022 being very hostile to the sector, Asia still wants our resources, and if we want to keep investing in it, they will keep buying it and remaining one of our second top export earner in the country.
Yeah, I guess they are one of our biggest customers. Saul Kavonic from MST Marquee, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ed.